To scan a Linux file system, generally you use the tool fsck, or just FISC as it's often referred to. Now, the real key though is to have it scan automatically, periodically on boot, so you don't have to manually do it. Because here's the deal, in order to run FISC, the file system itself has to be unmounted. That's not really a problem for secondary or tertiary drive mounts like the home directory or something like that, but the root directory, it's pretty difficult to unmount the root directory and scan it unless you're in the boot up process or you've booted from a CD or something. So I want to talk specifically about how to set up the system to scan the file system on boot, including the root file system, so that you can, have it automatically maintain itself. Now, when it comes to scanning automatically, there's a few different flowchart things that go on. The very first thing the kernel looks for is inside your fstab file, if the pass setting is set up. If it's a 0, if you have your dump and pass, and if the pass is set to 0, then it won't scan. It just absolutely will refuse to scan. It doesn't even look any further. It just stops right there and continues booting up the system. If, however, you have that partition set up with either a 1 or a 2, a 1 for the root partition, a 2 for any other kind of partition. If you have it set up, then it looks at the drive itself and it says, okay, has the maximum number of allowed mounts been reached? And if that threshold has been reached, it will scan the drive before it boots up. If not, if it hasn't met this maximum yet, then it's not going to scan. It's going to increment. It's going to say, okay, I'm going to mount one more time and add it to the number of times I've been mounted, but I'm not going to scan it. Even if the pass is set up to scan, it's not going to scan it if it hasn't met the max. Now, the max by default is -1, which means it's never going to scan, because that's just the way of saying, like, don't ever automatically mount. So by default, you're never going to get an automatic scanning, which is a little bit frustrating because you do want to have your system automatically scanned. So on Ubuntu here, I have dev SDB1 mounted on MNT 10 gig. Okay, so this is another partition. This is not my root partition, but it's mounted on MNT 10 gig. All right. If I look inside of the fstab file, we're going to see that on this partition that I have automatically mounted on boot, it's set up with a pass of 2, which means that it is going to check to see if it should scan automatically. Okay, it's not the root partition, so I don't have it set up with a pass of 1, but since it's set up with 2, it's going to check and say, okay, if it's time, I'm going to scan this. So let's get out of here. And how we can see what the maximum number of allowable mounts before it will scan is to use the tune2fs. We're going to do -L for a listing of dev SDB1. And it's going to show us this. Now, what you want to look for in here is this maximum mount count. Now, remember I said by default it doesn't ever scan. That's because this is set to -1, and you're never going to reach that because that's just the way of saying disable it. If we want to have it automatically scan every so often, we need to change this. So we would say tune2fs-c for count, and I'm going to say every 10 mounts I want it to scan in dev SDB1. Okay. So now the maximum mount count is 10. We can look at that by doing the same command over, and we can see now the maximum mount count is 10. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, every time the system boots, it mounts the partition. Well, we could speed that up. We could say umount dev SDB1, mount dev SDB1. We do that, and now if we look, it's going to increment it by 1 because we unmounted it and remounted it. So if we do that a bunch of times, and now we look back and see, okay, our mount count is now 16 and our maximum count that is allowed is 10. Well, why didn't it automatically scan? Well, it only does that on boot. So if we were to reboot the system, it would go through the flowchart and it would say, okay, you have your pass set to 2. So that means I need to check the drive and say, okay, drive, is your mount count higher than the maximum mount count allowed before a scan? And it will be. So if we do a reboot, and once it's booted back up, we look and run that tune2fs again. So sudo tune2fs-l dev SDB1. Now we're going to see that the mount count is down to 1, which means that it scanned it. It ran Fisk on boot before it was mounted, and it reset the mount count to 0, and then of course it mounted it, so now it's 1. So now it's not going to rescan that on boot until the mount count gets above this maximum mount count, and then it will do it automatically. And figuring out what number to set here can be kind of tricky, because here's the deal. If you're on a laptop, you might reboot fairly often, so you're going to want to have that number kind of high so it doesn't scan every single time. But if it's a big file server, maybe you rarely ever reboot it, maybe once a year. Well, in that case, you might want the mount count to be very low so that every time it gets rebooted, it does scan for consistency's sake. And then one more thing, if it's a huge partition with just millions and millions of files, it's going to take hours or days to scan. So maybe you don't want to scan it every time it mounts. It really depends on your situation. So plan out how often you want it to scan and the type of situation that you're in to make the best choice for your particular partition. And honestly, the best choice for you might actually be just to run Fisk manually. Just unmount the partition or boot from a CD or USB drive if you need to scan the root partition. Maybe you never want to automate the process. You only want to do it manually. For some cases, that's fine too. Regardless, it's important to know how the system works so that if you think you're automatically scanning, you really are. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.